The governor's office developed a plan. Here's how we're going to do it. He said, we're going to get John Dusty, one of the preeminent economists in the state of West Virginia. And he's going to help us develop a plan to achieve equitable outcomes. That's the term they use, because it came from the federal statute. We're going to send the Herbert Henson's Office of Minority Affairs to do a 55-county listening tour. They're going to talk to the people. They're going to bring back the type of projects that people say should be funded. He says the 134 legislators, they're going to go back to their constituents and they're going to ask what type of projects should be funded. And then everybody's going to come back together and in the 2023 legislative session and to review all the projects that have been submitted through the Herb Henson office, through the 134 legislators, and then go through this vetting process to determine what projects would be funded. That was the plan. They didn't do it. Herbert Henderson truncated their listening tour and didn't finish, never pulled together a report, and the governor's office never asked for any projects to be submitted. And the 134 legislators, none of them went out and talked to their constituents. So what did they do? They got in the back room together, Governor Jim Justice, House Speaker Roger Hanshaw, and the Senate President Craig Blair, and they had agreed what we're going to do with the majority of this money, we're going to give it to these large corporations. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars. That's what we're going to do with the money. When the Tuesday Morning Group challenged them by submitting a letter that we call the Economic Justice, Fairness, and Equity Movement Plan, where we delineated how the federal statute called for some money to be invested in heavily populated minority communities and other low-income distressed communities, how the West Virginia University, West Virginia Forward report had called for investment in some of these distressed communities, how the Alliance for the Economic Development of Southern West Virginia, which are the 10 higher education institutions headed by Marshall University and Washington State University, called for the same thing, how the federal law itself had enumerated things like small business development, small business incubators, improving housing, workforce development, job training, educational program, etc., as approved expenditures. And so we lay out a plan with specific pieces of legislation that's already in place that could be used really to fund these projects. The governor, House Speaker, and the Senate President wouldn't even talk to us, wouldn't even have a conversation with us. So we sent the letter to a lot of other legislators. And finally, we got a couple of the Democratic legislators to at least meet with us and talk with us. And we had a public hearing about our plan because the governor had introduced his supplemental appropriation bill, House Bill 2883, and there was $677 million remaining from the American Rescue Plan Act monies. And so the governor had submitted the budget as to how he wanted those money expended. And the bulk of the money in his original bill would go to the Economic Development Authority so that they could disseminate the money to corporations. And so we challenged that and we had the public hearing, but the legislature entertained the governor's bill, passed his bill, House Bill 2883, the Supplemental Appropriations Bill. $177 million went to water and sewer projects, which we certainly supported. There are some places around the state that still doesn't have clean, potable water. And then there was $10 to $12 million went into some other project. $1 million to Marshall University to promote economic development across the state of West Virginia in minority communities. $1 million, right, to Marshall, which most will be consumed in their overhead and their indirect costs. And then the bulk of the money, $482 million, was transferred to the Economic Development Authority. So I contacted the Economic Development Authority. They wouldn't respond to my call. I had some people to call the governor's office, and finally, the governor's office must have told Director Jill Upson with the Herbert Henson's Office of Minority, you called and talked to her. So she did. And she was very nice and very, very professional. She said, Reverend Watts, you don't quite understand. And when someone tells me that, I know I'm in for an interesting story because they have no idea what I do and do not understand. But she explained to me that the Economic Development Authority made the decision that they're going to allocate this money in $50 million increments to corporations, and that those corporations can match it with $50 million, and that's basically how they're going to spend the remaining $482 million. And most of the public aren't even aware of that. We tried to tell the people, they're getting ready to give your people to your money to these corporations. They believe in reverse Robin Hood economics. Take from the poor, take from working people, and find out a way to give that money to corporations, either as tax breaks or incentives. Now, this eventually will have to come out to the public, but they've already given hundreds of millions of dollars of the first 677 million to these corporations. So now here's where we are. And the Tuesday Morning Group is trying to bring attention to the reality. They pretty much allocated these American Rescue Plan federal dollars to these corporations, but there's a $1.7 billion surplus. $1.7 billion surplus. I want to know that people understand what that means. After all the bills in the state of West Virginia has been paid for the previous fiscal year, there's $1.7 billion that's left, right? Now, I know what they're going to do with quite a chunk of that money. They got to pay for those tax cuts that the governor requested and that the legislature authorized from last year. But there still should be 300 or 400 million that's left. So we're trying to mobilize the people to put pressure on the governor's office, pressure the governor to take $300 million of this money, earmark it to be strategically invested in heavily populated minority and other low-income communities, to focus on small business development, giving monies to existing small businesses so that they can expand, take on more business, hire more people, invest in creating more safe, affordable, non-public housing for people to rent, lease with options to purchase, to invest in workforce development and job training in some of these areas, to reinstitute a robust summer work program for youth ages 14 and 18 who are still in school. There's an academic enrichment program component to it. Invest in the people. That's consistent with the federal statute. It's consistent with the plan that the governor put together that he said that he and the legislature would implement. Now, I said earlier is that when we look back on this, we're going to realize this is one of the greatest missed opportunities to change the trajectory of communities and the individuals that reside there by strategically investing in those communities. If I were to poll most African Americans in West Virginia and ask them, do you believe in reparations? Do you believe the federal government should pay reparations to blacks? Well, most of the people would say, absolutely, I believe that. The closest thing that we're going to get to reparations is this money that's come from the federal government, in my opinion. It's the closest thing. The money is still here. And we should be demanding that the governor set some of this budget surplus aside, since they've given most of the American Rescue Plan Act money to these corporations, so that they can fulfill the intent of the federal statute, the spirit of the federal statute, and do something that's never been done before. A few months ago, Jim Justice said that he was the greatest governor in the history of West Virginia. He said that. And a few people wrote some op-ed pieces about it. What I would say to the governor, you got a chance to be the greatest governor in the history of the state because you've had the opportunity. You've had these unprecedented allocations of these federal dollars that came into the state of West Virginia. Therefore, you could actually do something that no other government has attempted to do, and that is actually fund strategic programs to address the state's most serious and systemic problem, and that is poverty. And to do that, you got to invest in the people at the local level. You got to invest in housing at the local level. You got to invest in small businesses that are the backbone of the West Virginia economy, particularly in these low wealth communities. And you've got to give some money to the existing small businesses so that they can increase their capacity, hire more people, take on more work, and generate more economic growth in these areas, as well as generating more tax revenue. The same formula that the Economic Development Authority uses for economic development with these large corporations, it will work for small businesses if the governor would take the initiative to do it. But unless the people challenge him to do it, unless they demand him to do it, and use this window of opportunity where he is a candidate to become a United States Senator, and the people need to make this issue of how this budget surplus is going to be expended the major issue that they force every politician to discuss during this current campaign season. in closing this segment, think about this. Yesterday was August the 28th. This is the time frame that we're taping this segment. The 60 years since the March on Washington, when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech, and when prodded and prompted by Mahalia Jackson, he goes into this soaring rhetoric about the dream that he has, about the type of nation that he hoped the United States would become, where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. It was soaring rhetoric. And people applauded, and there was euphoria at the end of that speech. And it's been played many, many times over. The problem is, 3 years later, Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when asked about that speech, he said it's become a nightmare. He retired the speech, and he would not give the speech again. He said he miscalculated the recalcitrant resistance that powerful people in America had to economic justice, to fairness, and to equality for marginalized people, and for black people in particular. His friend, Reverend Fred Shuttleworth, made one of the most powerful statements describing the resistance to change by the segregations in the South. Reverend Shuttleworth said, "We thought that we could shame America. We thought if the world saw how they were treating their Negro citizens, that they would do better and they would change." He said, what we learned is rattlesnakes don't commit suicide, he said. And ball players don't strike themselves out. They just don't give up, right? You have to put pressure on them. You have to demand. You have to dramatize your persistence, your resolve, your resilience, and your determination. You will not quit, and you will not accept injustice, inequality. So Martin Luther King had totally pivoted, and I'm amazed that people don't even know the Martin Luther King of 1967 and the Martin Luther King of 1968. The Martin Luther King that 13 years of the civil rights movement had brought him to a point. If you look at the speeches in the last year of his life in particular, the most strident speeches that he gave, August the 4th, 1967, 1 year to the date of his assassination in Memphis, he gave a speech against the Vietnam War and how that the nation was spending $335,000 to kill every Viet Cong and spending less than $50 on its war on poverty. He says it's not a war, it's nothing more than a skirmish. It's not even a good scrimmage. He talked about blacks living on a lonely island of poverty in the vast sea of material prosperity in a speech he'd given a few days earlier at Stanford University that he entitled The Other America, when he juxtapositioned white America with all of its affluence and wealth with that of black America. He talked about in another speech as he was preparing for the Poor People's Campaign in '68 that it didn't cost America anything to desegregate lunch counters. It didn't cost anything for them to give blacks the right to vote. It didn't cost anything to desegregate interstate bus travel. But it would cost billions of dollars for them to America to build the type of economic infrastructure needed to really rebuild black communities and inner cities and urban communities around the nation. He talked about those who would say that blacks should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But that was not the philosophy when this country was giving away millions of acres to its European immigrant peasants in the West, in the Midwest, so that they could become farmers. Millions of dollars were set aside to build the land grant institutions in the West and in the Midwest. And a whole county agent system was created to help them to improve their farming techniques and efficiencies. And then he talked about, then they gave them low interest loans so they could mechanize and so they could improve the efficiency of their farming and increase production. And he says, and now these children, grandchildren of these farmers have received all this land for free, these universities and the county agents and this money to mechanize. Now they were being subsidized and paid money not to grow crops as a part of the government subsidy. See, these same people say to black people, you'll pull yourself up by your bootstraps. How can you say that to a bootless man, King said. So King was strident and he was militant with his aggressive message of the need for economic justice, economic equality. And that was his theme as he was moving into what he called his last campaign, which would be the Poor People's Campaign. So I'm convinced if Martin Luther King was here today, he would say to us what he was saying in 1968. It's about economic justice. It's about fairness. It's about equality. We got to have the resources to rebuild our community, to build our people, to strengthen and stabilize families. And prayers and spiritual songs and shouting and dancing, they all have their place in church. But they don't have any currency. They're not legal tender at the grocery store. You can't pay your bills with that. You can't pay a mortgage with that. It takes the tender that the country recognizes. And that's why we're calling for an economic justice, fairness, and equality movement in this state, encouraging every person who's concerned about economic justice and fairness for black people, for low-income people. Call the governor's office, 304-558-2000. Tell him you support the Tuesday Morning's Economic Justice Plan. Encourage him to adopt it. Call your legislators. Write your legislators. Tell them to support this plan, to use some of the budget surplus to fund it and to finance it. And any politician that would dare ask you to vote for them or talk to you about voting, ask them a simple question. Do you support the Tuesday Morning Group's Economic Justice, Fairness, and Equity Plan? The $300 million be set aside so it can be strategically invested in heavily populated minority communities and other distressed communities. Force them to publicly say what their position is on that. And if they're not willing to do it, then they're not worthy of your vote. I'm not a politician. I'm not a political wannabe, right? I'm just a prophet, right? A watchman on the wall, trying to do the diligent research, analysis, to understand the systems, praying and asking the Lord for the ability to articulate it and lay it down so people can understand it, trying to warn people of what I see. And I think that things get much worse around this country, but in this state, much worse for African American people than what it currently is. If we don't take a stand now to try to get some of these resources in our community, many of our people just are going to collapse under the weight of what they've been under for so very, very long. And that's why I believe that this is indeed a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We must seize this moment, and we must speak up loudly and forcefully and adamantly and stridently. We must not be quiet. We must not be silent. We must agitate to be heard. And to my friend that's in the black upper middle class, in the black elite, I'm not angry with you, right? I'm not. I believe in the Du Bois principle, the talented tenth. I believe to whom much is given, much is also required. And I believe that the power and the influence that fraternities and sororities and lodges have could be leveraged to help to move the system, right? All I would ask, if you're not going to fight with us, don't defend the system. And don't be a shield for those in power, right? That we got to fight you to get to them. Just stand to the side and say to them, we don't know what's wrong with them, but y'all need to deal with them. You need to talk with them. You need to listen to what they have to say. And this is just kind of where we are. I gave a post of the morning, and I said, I'm looking for the black community. I'm tired of people talking about the black community because I can't find it. Because community comes from two words, common and unity. What do we share in common? And what are we unified to do to advance our people? So what do we share in common? We share our blackness in common. We share a history of oppression that is in common. We share the benefits, the sacrifices of those that went before us so that some of us get to where we are. That's what we share in common. And we should share a desire to see our children and our friends' children and the children of people we don't even know to thrive and to do better. So I'm hoping that if we can just agree on one thing, as this project is focused on one thing, improving education, literacy, and numeracy of our children, our grandchildren, of these young adults who've been pushed through the education system, but they haven't been educated. the literacy and numeracy skills are so low, if their life depended upon it, they couldn't pass the ASVAB test to get in the military. They require 10th grade literacy and numeracy skills. They couldn't, if their life depended on it, pass the graduate equivalency exam if they had to pass it to get out of school because they don't have the literacy and numeracy skills. That's the crisis that we're dealing with. And the larger crisis is a crisis of leadership, of vision, of passion, compassion, of caring, and of a willingness to sacrifice for the benefit of others and not always personally benefiting from it. Some of us have benefited enough from someone else's labor, someone else's sacrifice. It's now time for us to sacrifice so that our children, our grandchildren can benefit. So I'm hoping that this project will serve as a catalyst, as a seed, as an impetus to really ignite a movement. And what we need is a movement among our people to come together and find common ground and unite around that common ground and show the people of this state that we are courageous people and that we are caring people and that we're willing to do what is necessary to make sure our children have at least a chance at a future. God bless you all. Thank you.